Chapter 13 Lieutenant Mamiya's Long Story, Part 2.
What woke me was the metallic click of a rifle's safety being released. No soldier in battle could ever miss that sound, even in a deep sleep. It's how can I say it, a special sound, as cold and heavy as death itself. Almost instinctively, I reached for the Browning next to my pillow, but just then a shoe slammed into my temple, the impact blinding me momentarily. After I had brought my breathing under control, I opened my eyes just enough to see the man who must have kicked me. He was kneeling down and picking up my Browning. I slowly lifted my head to find the muzzles of two rifles pointed at my face. Beyond the rifles stood two Mongolian soldiers. I was sure I had fallen asleep in a tent, but the tent was gone now, and a sky full of stars shone overhead. Another Mongolian soldier was pointing a light machine gun at the head of Yamamoto, who was lying beside me. He lay utterly still, as if conserving his energy because he knew it was useless to resist. All of the Mongols wore long overcoats and battle helmets. Two of them were aiming large flashlights at Yamamoto and at me. At first I couldn't grasp what had happened. My sleep had been too deep and the shock too great. But the sight of the Mongolian soldiers and of Yamamoto's face left no doubt in my mind. Our tents had been discovered before we had a chance to ford the river. Then it occurred to me to wonder what had become of Honda and Hamano. I turned my head very slowly, trying to survey the area, but neither man was there. Either they had been killed already, or they had managed to escape. These had to be the men of the patrol we had seen earlier at the ford. They were few in number, and they were equipped with a light machine gun and rifles. In command was a ruggedly built non-com, the only one of the bunch to be wearing proper military boots. He was the man who had kicked me. He bent over and picked up the leather valise that Yamamoto had by his head. Opening it, he looked inside. Then he turned it upside down and shook it. All that fell to the ground was a pack of cigarettes. I could hardly believe it. With my own eyes, I had seen Yamamoto putting the document into that bag. He had taken it from a saddlebag, put it in this valise, and placed the valise by his pillow. Yamamoto struggled to maintain his cool, but I saw his expression momentarily begin to change. He obviously had no idea what had happened to the document, but whatever the explanation might be, its disappearance must have been a great relief to him. As he had said to me earlier, our number one priority was seeing to it that the document never fell into enemy hands. The soldiers dumped all our belongings on the ground and inspected them in detail, but they found nothing important. Next they stripped us and went through our pockets. They bayoneted our clothing and packs, but they found no document. They took our cigarettes and pens, our wallets and notebooks and watches, and pocketed them. By turns, they tried on our shoes, and anyone they fit took them. The men's arguments over who got what became pretty intense, but the non-com ignored them. I suppose it was normal among the Mongols to take booty from prisoners of war and enemy dead. The non-com took only Yamamoto's watch, leaving the other items for his men to fight over. The rest of our equipment, our pistols and ammunition and maps and compasses and binoculars, went into a cloth bag, no doubt for sending to Ulaanbaatar headquarters. Next they tied us up, naked, with a strong thin rope. At close range, the Mongol soldiers smelled like stable that had not been cleaned for a long time. Their uniforms were shabby, filthy with mud and dust, and food stains to the point where it was all but impossible to tell what the original color had been. Their shoes were full of holes and falling off their feet, quite literally. No wonder they wanted ours. They had brutish faces for the most part, their teeth a mess, their hair long and wild. They looked more like mountain bandits or highwaymen than soldiers. But their Soviet-made weapons and their starred insignia indicated that they were regular troops of the Mongolian People's Republic. To me, of course, their discipline as a fighting unit and their military spirit seemed rather poor. Mongols make for tough, long-suffering soldiers, but they are not much suited to modern group warfare. The night was freezing cold. Watching the white clouds of the Mongolian soldiers' breath bloom and vanish in the darkness, I felt as if a strange error had brought me into the landscape of someone else's nightmare. I couldn't grasp that this was actually happening. It was indeed a nightmare, but only later did I come to realize that it was just the beginning of a nightmare of enormous proportions. A short time later, one of the Mongolian soldiers came out of the darkness, dragging something heavy. With a big smile, he threw the object on the ground next to us. It was Hamano's corpse. The feet were bare. Someone had already taken his boots. They proceeded to strip his clothes off, examining everything they could find in his pockets. Hands reached out for his watch, his wallet, and his cigarettes. They divided up the cigarettes and smoked them while looking through the wallet. They yielded a few pieces of Manchukuo paper money and a photo of a woman who was probably Hamano's mother. The officer in charge said something and took the money. The photo was flung to the ground. One of the Mongolian soldiers must have sneaked up behind Hamano and slit his throat while he was standing guard. They had done to us first what we had been planning to do to them. Bright red blood was flowing from the body's gaping wound. But for such a big wound, there was not much blood. Most of it had probably been lost by then. One of the soldiers pulled a knife from the scabbard on his left belt. Its curved blade some 6 inches long. He waved it in my face. I had never seen such an oddly shaped knife. It seemed to have been designed for some special purpose. The soldiers made a throat-slashing motion with the knife and whistled through his teeth. Some of the others laughed. Rather than government tissue, the knife seemed to be the man's personal property. Everyone had a long bayonet at his waist. But this man was the only one carrying a curved knife, and he had apparently used it to slit Hamano's throat. After a few deft swirls on the blade, he returned it to its scabbard. Without a word, and moving only his eyes, Yamamoto sent a glance in my direction. It lasted just an instant, but I knew immediately what he was trying to say. "Do you think Corporal Honda managed to get away?" Through all the confusion and terror, I had been thinking the same thing. Where is Corporal Honda? If Honda escaped the sudden attack of the outer Mongolian troops, there might be some chance for us, a slim chance, perhaps, and the question of what Honda could do out there alone was depressing. But some chance was better than no chance at all. They kept us tied up all night, lying on the sand. 2 soldiers were left to watch over us, one with a light machine gun, the other with a rifle. The rest sat some distance away, smoking, talking, and laughing, seemingly relaxed now that they had captured us. Neither Yamamoto nor I said a word. The dawn temperature dropped to freezing in that place, even in May. I thought we might freeze to death, lying there naked, but the cold itself was nothing in comparison with the terror I felt. I had no idea what we were in for. These men were simple patrol unit. They probably did not have the authority to decide what to do with us. They had to wait for orders, which meant that we would probably not be killed right away. After that, however, there is no way to tell what would happen. Yamamoto, more than likely a spy, and I had been caught with him, so naturally I would be seen as an accomplice. In any case, we would not get off easily. Sometime after dawn broke, a sound like the drone of an airplane engine came out of the distant sky. Eventually, the silver-colored fuselage entered my field of vision. It was a Soviet-made reconnaissance plane bearing the insignia of Outer Mongolia. The plane circled above us several times. The soldiers all waved, and the plane dipped its wing in return. Then it landed in a nearby open area, sending up clouds of sand. The earth was hard here, and there were no obstructions, which made it relatively easy to take off and land without a runway. For all I knew, they might have used the same spot for this purpose any number of times. One of the soldiers mounted a horse and galloped off towards the plane with 2 saddled horses in tow. When they returned, the 2 horses carried men who appeared to be high-ranking officers. One was Russian, the other Mongolian. I assumed that the patrol had radioed headquarters about our capture, and that the 2 officers had made the trip from Ulaanbaatar to interrogate us. They were intelligence officers, no doubt. I had heard that the GPU was at work behind the scenes in the previous year's mass arrest and purge of anti-government activists. Both officers wore immaculate uniforms and were clean-shaven. The Russian wore a kind of trench coat with a belt. His boots shone with an unblemished luster. He was a thin man, but not very tall for a Russian, and perhaps in his early 30s. He had a wide forehead, a narrow nose, and his skin almost pale pink in color, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses. Overall, though, this was a face that made no impression to speak of. Standing next to him, the short, stout, dark Mongolian officer looked like a little bear. The Mongolian called the non-com aside, and the three men talked for a while. I guess that the officers were asking for a detailed report. The non-com brought over a bag containing the things they had confiscated from us and showed them to the others. The Russians studied each object with great care, then put them all back into the bag. He said something to the Mongolian, who in turn spoke to the non-com. Then the Russian took a cigarette case from his breast pocket and opened it for the other two. They went on talking and smoking together. Sometimes, as he spoke, the Russian slammed his right fist into his left arm. He looked somewhat annoyed. The Mongolian officer kept his arms folded and his face grim, while the non-com shook his head now and then. Eventually, the Russian officer ambled over to where we lay on the ground. "Would you like a smoke?" he asked in Russian. As I said earlier, I had studied Russian in college and could follow a conversation pretty well, but I pretended not to understand, so as to avoid any difficulties. "Thanks, but no thanks," said Yamamoto in Russian. He was good. "Excellent," said the Soviet army officer. "Things will go more quickly if we can speak in Russian." He removed his gloves and put them in his coat pocket. A small gold ring shone on his left hand. "As you are no doubt aware, we are looking for certain something. Looking very hard for it, and we know you have it. Don't ask how we know, we just know. But you do not have it on you now, which means that logically speaking, you must have hidden it before you were captured. You haven't transported it over there." He motioned toward the Khalkha River. "None of you have crossed the river. The letter must be on this side, hidden somewhere. Do you understand what I've said to you so far?" Yamamoto nodded. "I understand," he said, "but we know nothing about a letter." "Fine," said the Russian, expressionless. "In that case, I have one little question to ask you. What were you men doing over here? As you know, this territory belongs to the Mongolian People's Republic. What was your purpose in entering land that belongs to others? I want to hear your reason for this." "Map making," Yamamoto explained. "I am a civilian employee of a map company, and this man and the one they killed were with me for protection. We knew that this side of the river was your territory, and we are sorry for having crossed the border, but we did not think ourselves as having made a territorial violation. We simply wanted to observe the topography from the vantage point of the plateau on this side." Far from amused, the Russian officer curled his lips into a smile. "We are sorry," he said slowly. "Yes, of course, you wanted to see the topography from the plateau. Yes, of course, the view is always better from high ground. It makes perfect sense." For a time he said nothing, but he stared at the clouds in the sky. Then he returned his gaze to Yamamoto, shook his head slowly, and sighed. "If only I could believe what you're telling me, how much better it would be for all of us. If only I could pat you on the shoulder and say, 'Yes, yes, I see. Now run along home across the river and be more careful in the future.' I truly wish I could do this, but unfortunately I cannot, because I know who you are, and I know what you are doing here. We have friends in Hailar, just you have friends in Ulaanbaatar." He took the gloves from his pocket, refolded them, and put them back. "Quite honestly, I have no personal interest in hurting you or killing you. If you would simply give me the letter, then I would have no further business with you. You would be released from this place immediately at my discretion. You could cross the river and go home. I promise you that, on my honor. Anything else that happened would be an internal matter for us. It would have nothing to do with you." The light of the sun from the east was finally beginning to warm my skin. There was no wind, and a few white clouds floated in the sky. A long, long silence followed. No one said a word. The Russian officer, the Mongolian officer, the men of the patrol, and Yamamoto each preserved his own sphere of silence. Yamamoto had seemed resigned to his death from the moment of our capture. His face never showed the slightest hint of expression. "The two of you will almost certainly die here," the Russian went on slowly, a phrase at a time, as if speaking to children. "And it will be a terrible death." And here the Russian glanced towards the Mongolian soldiers. The big one, holding the machine gun, looked at me with a snaggle-toothed grin. "They love to kill people in ways that involve great difficulty and imagination. They are, shall we say, aficionados. Since the days of Genghis Khan, the Mongols have enjoyed devising particularly cruel ways to kill people. We Russians are painfully aware of this. It is part of our history lessons in school. We study what the Mongols did when they invaded Russia. They killed millions, for no reason at all. They captured hundreds of Russian aristocrats in Kiev and killed them all together. Do you know that story? They cut huge thick planks, laid Russians beneath them, and held a banquet on top of the planks, crushing them to death beneath their weight. Ordinary humans would never think of such a thing, don't you agree? It took time and tremendous amount of preparation. Who else would have gone to the trouble? But they did. And why? Because it was a form of amusement to them. And they still enjoy doing those things. I saw them in action once, and I thought I had seen some terrible things in my day. But that night, as you can imagine, I lost my appetite. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Am I speaking too quickly?" Yamamoto shook his head. "Excellent," said the Russian. He paused, clearing his throat. "Of course, this will be the second time for me. Perhaps my appetite will have returned by dinner time. If possible, however, I would prefer to avoid unnecessary killing." Hands clasped together behind his back, he looked up at the sky for a time. Then he took his gloves out and glanced toward the plain. "Beautiful weather," he said. "Spring. Still a little cold, but just about right. Any hotter and there would be mosquitoes. Terrible mosquitoes. Yes, spring is much better than summer." He took out his cigarette case again, put a cigarette between his lips, and lit it with his match. Slowly he drew the smoke into his lungs, and slowly he let it out again. "I'm going to ask you once more. Do you insist that you really know nothing about that letter?" Yamamoto said only one word. "Niet." "Fine," said the Russian. "Fine." Then he said something in Mongolian to the Mongolian officer. The man nodded and barked an order to the soldiers. They carried over some rough logs and began to sharpen them with their bayonets, quickly turning them into 4 stakes. Pacing off the distance between the stakes, they pounded them into the ground with rocks at the 4 corners of a square. All these preparations took some 20 minutes to complete, I guessed, but I had absolutely no idea what they were for. The Russian said, "To them, an excellent slaughter is like an excellent meal. The longer they take with their preparations, the more enjoyment they derive from the act. Simply killing a man is no problem. One pistol shot and it's all over. But that would not be..." And here he ran his fingertips slowly over his smooth chin. "Very interesting." They untied Yamamoto and led him to the staked-off area. There they tied his arms and legs to the 4 stakes. Stretched out on the ground, stark naked, Yamamoto had several raw wounds on his body. "As you know, these people are shepherds," said the Russian officer. "And shepherds use their sheep in many ways. They eat their flesh, they shear their wool, they take their hides. To them, sheep are the perfect animal. They spend their days with sheep, their whole lives with sheep. They know how to skin them with amazing skill. The hides they use for tents and clothing. Have you ever seen them skin a sheep?" "Just kill me and get it over with," said Yamamoto. The Russian brought his palms together and said, while rubbing them slowly, nodded to Yamamoto. "Don't worry," he said. "We will be certain to kill you. I guarantee you that. It may take a little time, but you will die. There's nothing to worry about on that score. We are in no hurry. Here we are in the vast wilderness, where there is nothing as far as the eye can see. Only time. All the time we need. And I have many things I wish to tell you. Now, as to the procedure of skinning, every band has at least one specialist, one professional as it were, who knows everything there is to know about cutting off the skin. A man of miraculous skill. His skinning is a work of art. He does it in a twinkling of an eye. With such speed and dexterity, you'd think that the creature being skinned alive never noticed what was happening. But of course, he took the cigarette case from his breast pocket once again, shifted it to his left hand, and tapped upon it with the fingers on his right. Not to notice such a thing would be out of question. The one being skinned alive experiences terrible pain, unimaginable pain, and it takes an incredibly long time for death to come. Massive hemorrhaging is what does it finally, but that takes time. He snapped his fingers. The Mongolian soldier stepped forward. From his coat pocket he produced a sheathed knife. It was shaped like the one used before by the soldier who had made the throat-slitting gesture. He pulled the knife from his sheath and held it aloft. In the morning sun, the blade shone with a dull white gleam. "This man is one of those professionals of whom I spoke," said the Russian officer. "I want you to look at his knife closely. It is a very special knife, designed for skinning, and it is extraordinarily well made. The blade is as thin and sharp as a razor, and the technical skill these people bring to the task is extremely high. They've been skinning animals for thousands of years after all. They can take a man's skin off the way you'd peel a peach, beautifully, without a single scratch." "Am I speaking too quickly for you, by any chance?" Yamamoto said nothing. "They do a small area at a time," said the Russian officer. "They have to work slowly if they want to remove the skin cleanly, without any scratches. If, in the meantime, you feel you want to say something, please let me know. Then you won't have to die. Our man here has done this several times, and never once has he failed to make the person talk. Keep that in mind. The sooner we stop, the better for both of us." Holding his knife, the bear-like Mongolian officer looked at Yamamoto and grinned. To this day, I remember that smile. I see it in my dreams. I have never been able to forget it. No sooner had he flashed this smile than he set to work. His men held Yamamoto down with their hands and knees while he began skinning Yamamoto with the utmost care. It truly was like skinning a peach. I couldn't bear to watch. I closed my eyes. When I did this, one of the soldiers hit me with his rifle butt. He went on hitting me until I opened my eyes, but it hardly mattered. The eyes opened or closed. I could still hear Yamamoto's voice. He bore the pain without a whimper at first, but soon he began to scream. I had never heard such screams before. They did not seem part of this world. The man started slitting open Yamamoto's shoulder and proceeded to peel off the skin of his right arm from the top down, slowly, carefully, almost lovingly. As the Russian officer had said, it was something like a work of art. One would never have imagined there was any pain involved if it weren't for the screams. But the screams told the horrendousness of the pain that accompanied the work. Before long, the entire skin of Yamamoto's right arm had come off in a single, thin sheet. The skinner handed it to the man beside him, who held it open in his fingertips, circulating among the others to give them a good look. All the while, blood kept dripping from the skin. Then the officer turned to Yamamoto's left arm, repeating the same procedure. Again that he skinned both legs, cut off the penis and testicles, and removed the ears. Then he skinned the head and the face and everything else. Yamamoto lost consciousness, regained it, and lost it again. The screams would stop whenever he passed out, and continue when he came to again. But his voice gradually weakened, and finally gave out altogether. All this time, the Russian officer drew meaningless patterns on the ground with the heel of his boot. The Mongolian soldiers watched the procedure in silence. Their faces remained expressionless, showing neither disgust nor excrement nor shock. They watched Yamamoto's skin being removed a piece at a time, with the same kind of faces we might have if we were out for a stroll and stopped to have a look at a construction site. Meanwhile, I did nothing but vomit, over and over again. Long after it seemed there was nothing more for me to bring up, I continued to vomit. At last, The bear-like Mongolian officer held up the skin of Yamamoto's torso, which he had so cleanly peeled off. Even the nipples were intact. Never to this day have I seen anything so horrible. Someone took the skin from him and spread it out to dry the way we might dry a shit. All that remained lying on the ground was Yamamoto's corpse, a bloody red lump of meat from which every trace of skin had been removed. The most painful sight was the face. 2 large white eyeballs stared out from the red mass of flesh. Teeth bared, the mouth stretched wide open as if in a shot. 2 little holes were all that remained where the nose had been removed. The ground was a sea of blood. 2 little holes were all that remained where the nose had been removed. The ground was a sea of blood. The Russian officer spit on the ground and looked at me. Then he took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his mouth. "The fellow really didn't know anything, did he?" he said, putting the handkerchief back. His voice sounded somewhat flatter than it had before. "If he had known, he would have talked. Pity. But any case, the man was a professional. He was bound to have an ugly death sooner or later. Well, can't be helped. And if he knew nothing, there's no way that he could know anything." He put a cigarette between his lips and struck a match. "Which means you are no longer of any use to us. Not worth torturing for information. Not worth keeping alive as a prisoner. We want to dispose of this affair in the utmost secrecy. There could be complications if we brought you back to Ulaanbaatar. The best thing, of course, would be to put a bullet in your brain here and now, then bury you or burn you or throw your ashes into Khalkha. That would be a simple end to the matter. Don't you agree?" He fixed his eyes on mine. I continued to pretend I could not understand him. "You don't understand Russian, I suppose? It's a waste of time to spell this out to you." Well, I might as well be talking to myself. So hear me out. In any case, I have good news for you. I have decided not to kill you. Think of this as my own small expression of penitence for having pointlessly killed your friend in spite of myself. We've all had our fill of killing this morning. Once a day is more than enough. And so I will not kill you. Instead, I will give you a chance to survive. If all goes well, you may even come out of this alive. The chances of that happening are not good, of course. Perhaps non-existent. But a chance is a chance. At least, it is far better than being skinned alive. Don't you agree? He raised his hand and summoned the Mongolian officer. With great care, the man had been washing his knife with water from a canteen and had just finished sharpening it on a whetstone. The soldiers had laid out the pieces of Yamamoto's skin and were standing by them, discussing something. They seemed to be exchanging opinions on the finer points of the skinner's technique. The Mongolian officer put his knife in its scabbard and then into the pocket of his coat before approaching us. He looked me in the face for a moment, then turned into his fellow officer. The Russian spoke a few short Mongolian phrases to him, and without expression, the man nodded. A soldier brought 2 horses for them. "We'll be going back to Ulaanbaatar now," the Russian said to me. "I hate to return empty-handed, but it can't be helped. Win some, lose some. I hope my appetite comes back by dinner time, but I rather doubt it will." They mounted their horses and left. The plane took off, became a silver speck in the western sky, then disappeared altogether, leaving me alone with the Mongolian soldiers and their horses. They set me on a horse and lashed me to the saddle. Then, in formation, we moved out to the north. The soldiers just in front of me kept singing some monotonous melody in a voice that was barely audible. Aside from that, there was nothing to be heard but the dry sound of the horses' hooves kicking off sand. I had no idea where they were taking me or what they were going to do to me. All I knew was that, to them, I was a superfluous being of no value whatever. Over and over in my head, I repeated to myself the words of the Russian officer. He had said that he would not kill me, but my chances of surviving were almost non-existent. What could this mean? It was too vague for me to grasp in any concrete way. Perhaps they were going to use me in some kind of horrible game. They wouldn't simply dispatch me, because they planned to enjoy the dreadful contrivance at their leisure. But at least they hadn't killed me. At least they hadn't skinned me alive like Yamamoto. I might not be able to avoid being killed in the end, but not like that. I was alive for now. I was still breathing, And if what the Russian officer had said was true, I would not be killed immediately. The more time that lay between me and death, the more chance I had to survive. It might be a minuscule chance, but all I could do was cling to it. Then, all of a sudden, the words of Corporal Honda flared to life again in my brain. That strange prognostication of his that I would not die on the continent. Even as I sat there, tied to the saddle, the skin of my naked back burning in the desert sun, I repeatedly savored every syllable that he had spoken. I let myself dwell on his expression, his intonation, the sound of each word, and I resolved to believe him from the bottom of my heart. No, I was not going to lie down and die in a place like this. I would come out of this alive. I would tread my native soil once again. We traveled north for 2 hours or more, coming to a stop near a Lamaish devotional mound. These stone markers, called Obu, served both as the garden deity for travelers and as valuable signposts in the desert. Here the men dismounted and untied my ropes. Supporting my weight from either side, 2 of them led me a short distance away. I figured this was where I would be killed. A well had been dug into the earth here. The mouth of the well was surrounded by a 3-foot-high stone curve. They made me kneel down beside it, grabbed my neck from behind, and forced me to look inside. I couldn't see a thing in the solid darkness. The non-com with the boots found a fist-sized rock and dropped it into the well. Some time later came the dry sound of a stone hitting the sand. So the well was a dry one, apparently. It had once served as a well in the desert, but it must have dried up long before, owing to a movement of the subterranean vein of water. Judging from the time it took the stone to hit the bottom, it seemed to be fairly deep. The non-com looked at me with a big grin. Then he took a large automatic pistol from the leather holster on his belt. He released the safety and fed a bullet into the chamber with a loud click. Then he put the muzzle of the gun against my head. He held it there for a long time, but did not pull the trigger. Then he slowly lowered the gun and raised his left hand, pointing towards the well. Licking my dry lips, I stared at the gun in his fist. What he was trying to tell me was this. I had a choice between 2 fates. I could have him shoot me now, just die and get it over with, or I could jump into the well. Because it was so deep, if I landed badly, I might be killed. If not, I would die slowly at the bottom of a dark hole. It finally dawned on me that this was the chance the Russian officer had spoken of. The Mongolian non-com pointed at the watch that he had taken from Yamamoto and held up 5 fingers. He was giving me 5 seconds to decide. When he got to 3, I stepped onto the well curb and leaped inside. I had no choice. I had hoped to be able to cling to the wall and work my way down, but he gave me no time for that. My hands missed the wall, and I tumbled down. It seemed to take a very long time for me to hit the bottom. In reality, it could not have been more than a few seconds, but I do recall thinking about a great many things on my way down. I thought about my hometown, so far away. I thought about the girl I slept with just once before they shipped me out. I thought about my parents. I recall feeling grateful that I had a younger sister and not a brother. Even if I was killed, they would still have her and not have to worry about her being taken by the army. I thought about rice cakes wrapped in oak leaves. Then I slammed into dry ground and lost consciousness for a moment. It felt as if the air inside me had burst through the walls of my body. I thudded against the well bottom like a sandbag. It truly was just a moment that I lost consciousness from the impact, I believe. When I came to, I felt some kind of a spray hitting me. At first I thought it was rain, but I was wrong. It was urine. The Mongolian soldiers were all peeing on me where I lay in the bottom of the well. I looked up to see them in silhouette far above me, taking turns coming to the edge of the round hole to pee. There was a terrible unreality to the sight, like a drug-induced hallucination, but it was real. I was really in the bottom of the well, and they were spraying me with a real pee. Once they had finished, someone shone a flashlight on me. I heard them laughing, and then they disappeared from the edge of the hole. After that, everything sank into deep silence. For a while, I thought it best to lie there face down, waiting to see if they would come back. But after 20 minutes had gone by, then 30, as far as I could tell without a watch, they did not come back. They had gone away and left me, it seemed. I had been abandoned at the bottom of a well in the middle of the desert. Once it was clear that they would not be returning, I decided to check myself over for injuries. In the darkness, this was no easy feat. I couldn't see my own body. I couldn't tell with my own eyes what condition it was in. I could only resort to my perceptions. But I could not be sure that the perceptions I was experiencing in the darkness were accurate. I felt I was being deceived, deluded. It was a very strange feeling. Little by little, though, and with great attention to detail, I began to grasp my situation. The first thing I realized was that I had been extremely lucky. The bottom of the well was relatively soft and sandy, and if it hadn't been, then the impact of falling such a distance would have broken every bone in my body. I took one long deep breath and tried to move. First I tried moving my fingers. They responded, although somewhat feebly. Then I tried to raise myself to a sitting position on the earthen surface, but this I was unable to do. My body felt as if it had lost all sensation. My mind was fully conscious, but there was something wrong with the connection between my mind and my body. My mind would decide to do something, but it was unable to convert the thought into muscular activity. I gave up and, for a while, lay there quietly in the dark. Just how long I remained still, I have no idea. But little by little, my perceptions began to return. And along with the recovery of my perceptions, naturally enough, came the sensation of pain, intense pain. Almost certainly my leg was broken, and my shoulder might be dislocated, or perhaps, if luck was against me, even broken. I lay still, enduring the pain. Before I knew it, tears were streaming down my cheek, tears of pain, and even more, tears of despair. I don't think you'll ever be able to understand what it is like, the utter loneliness, the feeling of desperation, to be abandoned in a deep well in the middle of the desert, at the edge of the world, overcome with intense pain in total darkness. I went so far as to regret that the Mongolian non-com had not simply shot me and gotten it over with. If I had been killed that way, at least they would have been aware of my death. If I died here, however, it would be a truly lonely death, a death of no concern to anyone, a silent death. Now and then, I heard the sound of the wind. As it moved across the surface of the earth, the wind made an uncanny sound at the mouth of the well, a sound like the moan of a woman in tears in a far-off world. That world and this were joined by a narrow shaft, through which the woman's voice reached me here, though only at long, irregular intervals. I had been left all alone in deep silence, and even deeper darkness. Enduring the pain, I reached out to touch the earthen floor around me. The well bottom was flat. It was not very wide, maybe 5 or 5.5 feet. As I was groping the ground, my hand suddenly came upon a hard, sharp object. In reflexive fear, I drew my hand back, but slowly and carefully, I reached out toward the thing. Again my fingers came in contact with the sharp object. At first I thought it was a tree branch, but soon enough I realized I was touching bones. Not human bones, but those of a small animal, which had been scattered at random, either by the passage of time or by my fall. There was nothing else at the bottom of the well, just sand, fine and dry. Next I ran my palm over the wall. It seemed to be made of thin, flat stones, as hot as the desert surface became in daytime. That heat did not penetrate to this world below ground. The stone had an icy chill to them. I ran my hand over the wall, examining the gaps between the stones. If I could get a foothold there, I might be able to climb to the surface, but the gaps turned out to be too narrow for that, and in my battered state, climbing seemed all but impossible. With a tremendous effort, I dragged myself closer to the wall and raised myself against it into a sitting position. Every move made my leg and shoulder throb as if they had been stuck with hundreds of thick needles. For a while after that, each breath made me feel that my body might crack apart. I touched my shoulder and realized it was hot and swollen. How much time went by after that, I do not know. But at one point, something happened that I never would have imagined. The light of the sun shot down from the opening of the well like some kind of revelation. In that instant, I could see everything around me. The well was filled with brilliant light, a flood of light. The brightness was almost stifling. I could hardly breathe. The darkness and cold were swept away in a moment, and warm, gentle light of the sun, which now warmly illuminated the white bones of the small animal beside me. This bone, which could have been an omen of my own impending fate, seemed in the sunlight more like a comforting companion. I could see the stone walls that encircled me. As long as I remained in the light, I was able to forget about my fear and pain and despair. I sat in the dazzling light in blank amazement. Then the light disappeared as suddenly as it had come. Deep darkness covered everything once again. The whole interval had been extremely short. In terms of the clock, it must have lasted 10 or at the most 15 seconds. No doubt, because of the angles involved, this was all the sun could manage to shine straight down to the bottom of the hole in any single day. The flood of sunlight was gone before I could begin to comprehend its meaning. After the light faded, I found myself in an even deeper darkness than before. I was all but unable to move. I had no water, no food, not a scrap of clothing on my body. The long afternoon went by, and night came. And when the temperature plunged, I could hardly sleep. My body craved sleep, but the cold prickled my skin like 1,000 tiny thorns. I felt as if my life's core was stiffening and dying bit by bit. Above me, I could see stars frozen in the sky, terrifying numbers of stars. I stared up at them, watching as they slowly crept along. Their movement helped me ascertain that time was continuing to flow on. I slept for a while, awoke with the cold and pain, slept a little more, then woke again. Eventually, morning came. From the round mouth of the well, the sharp pinpoints of starlight began to fade. Still, even after dawn broke, the stars did not disappear completely. Faint almost to the point of imperceptibility, they continued to linger there, on and on. To slake my thirst, I licked the morning dew that clung to the stone wall. The amount of water was minuscule, of course, but to me, it tasted like a bounty from heaven. The thought crossed my mind that I had had neither food nor water for an entire day, and yet I had no sense of hunger. I remained there, still, in the bottom of the hole. It was all I could do. I couldn't even think. So profound were my feelings of loneliness and despair. I sat there doing nothing, thinking nothing. Unconsciously, however, I waited for all that ray of light, that blinding flood of sunlight that poured straight down to the bottom of the well for one tiny fraction of the day. It must have been a phenomenon that occurred very close to noon, when the sun was at the highest point in the sky, and its light struck the surface of the earth at right angles. I waited for the coming of the light and for nothing else. There was nothing else I could wait for. A very long time went by, it seems. At some point, I drifted into sleep. By the time I sensed the presence of something and woke, the light was already there. I realized that I was being enveloped once again by that overwhelming light. Almost unconsciously, I spread open both of my hands and received the sun in my palms. It was far stronger than it had been the first time, and it lasted far longer than it had then. At least it felt that way to me. In the light, tears poured out of me. I felt as if all the fluids of my body might turn into tears and come streaming from my eyes. That my body itself might melt away like this. If it could have happened in the bliss of this marvelous light, even death would have been no threat. Indeed, I felt I wanted to die. I had a marvelous sense of oneness, an overwhelming sense of unity. Yes, that was it. The true meaning of life resided in that light that lasted for however many seconds it was, and I felt I ought to die right then and there. But of course, before anything could happen, the light was gone. I was still there, in the bottom of the miserable well. Darkness and cold reasserted their grip on me, as if to declare that light had never existed at all. For a long time, I simply remained huddled where I was, my face bathed in tears. As if beaten down by some huge power, I was unable to do or even to think anything at all, unable to feel even my own physical existence. I was a dried-up carcass, the cast-off shell of an insect. But then, once again, into the empty room of my mind returned the prophecy of Corporal Honda. I would not die on the continent. Now, after that light had come and gone, I found myself able to believe his prophecy. I could believe it now because in a place where I should have died, and at a time when I should have died, I had been unable to die. It was not that I would not die, I could not die. Do you understand what I'm saying, Mr. Okada? Whatever heavenly grace I may have enjoyed until that moment was lost forever. At this point in his story, Lieutenant Mamiya looked at his watch, and as you can see, he added softly, "Here I am." He shook his head as if trying to sweep away the invisible threads of memory. Just as Mr. Honda has said, I did not die on the continent, and of the four of us who went there, I have lived the longest. I nodded in response. Please forgive me for talking at such length. It must have been very boring for you, listening to a useless old man chatter on about the old days. Lieutenant Mamiya shifted his position on the sofa. My goodness, I'll be late for my train if I stay any longer. I hastened to restrain him. Please don't end your story there, I said. What happened after that? I want to hear the rest. He looked at me for a moment. How would this be, then? He said. I really am running late, so why don't you walk with me to the bus stop? I can probably give you a quick summary along the way. I left the house with him and walked to the bus stop. On the third morning, I was saved by Corporal Honda. He had sensed that the Mongols were coming for us that night, slipped out of the tent, and remained in hiding all that time. He had taken the document from Yamamoto's bag with him. He did this because our number one priority was to see it that the document would not fall into enemy hands, no matter how great the sacrifice we had to make. No doubt you are wondering why, if he realized the Mongols were coming, Corporal Honda ran away by himself instead of waking the rest of us so that we could escape together. The simple fact of the matter is that we had no hope of winning in such a situation. They knew that we were there. It was their territory. They had us far outnumbered and outgunned. It would have been the simplest thing in the world for them to find us, kill us, and take the document. Given the situation, Corporal Honda had no choice but to escape by himself. On the battlefield, his actions would have been a clear case of deserting under fire. But on a special assignment like ours, the most important thing is resourcefulness. He saw everything that happened. He watched them skinning Yamamoto. He saw Mongolian soldiers take me away. But he no longer had a horse, so he could not follow immediately. He had to come on foot. He dug up the extra supplies that we had buried in the desert, and there he buried the document. Then he came after me. For him to find me down in the well, though, required tremendous effort. He didn't even know which direction we had taken. How did he find the well? I asked. I don't know, said Lieutenant Mamiya. He didn't say much about that. He just knew. I'd say when he found me, he tore his clothing into strips and made a long rope. By then, I was practically unconscious, which made it all more difficult for him to pull me up. Then he managed to find a horse and put me on it. He took me across the dunes, across the river, and to the Manchukuo army post. There they treated my wounds and put me on a truck sent out by headquarters. I was taken to the hospital in Hailar. Whatever happened to that document or letter or whatever it was? It's probably still there, sleeping in the earth near the Khalkha river. For Corporal Honda and me to go all the way back and dig it up would have been out of the question, nor could we find any reason to make such an effort. We arrived at the conclusion that such a thing should have never existed in the first place. We coordinated our stories for the army investigation. We decided to insist that we had heard nothing about any document. Otherwise, they probably would have held us responsible for not bringing it back from the desert. They kept us in separate rooms under strict guard, supposedly for medical treatment, and they questioned us every day. All these high-ranking officers would come and make us tell our stories over and over again. Their questions were meticulous and very clever, but they seemed to believe us. I told them every little detail of what had happened, what I had experienced, being careful to omit anything I knew about the document. Once they got it all down, they warned me that this was a top-secret matter that would not appear in the army's formal records, that I was never to mention it to anyone, and that I would be severely punished if I did. 2 weeks later, I was sent back to my original post, and I believe that Corporal Honda was also returned to his home unit. One thing is not clear to me, I said. Why did they go to all the trouble of bringing Mr. Honda from his unit for this assignment? He never said much to me about that. He had probably been forbidden to tell anyone, and I suspect that he thought it would be better for me not to know. Judging from my conversations with him, though, I imagine there was some kind of personal relationship between him and the man they called Yamamoto, something that had to do with his special powers. I had often heard that the army had a unit devoted to the study of the occult. They supposedly gathered people with these spiritual or psychokinetic powers from all over the country and conducted experiments on them. I suspect that Mr. Honda met Yamamoto in that connection. In any case, without those powers of his, Mr. Honda would never have been able to find me in the well and guide me to the exact location of the Manchukuo army outpost. He had neither map nor compass, yet he was able to head us straight there without the slightest uncertainty. Common sense would have told you that such a thing was impossible. I was a professional map maker, and I knew the geography of the area quite well, but I could never have done what he did. These powers of Mr. Honda were probably what Yamamoto was looking to him for.
We reached the bus stop and waited.
Certain things will always remain as riddles, of course, said Lieutenant Mamiya. There are many things I still don't understand. I still wonder who that lone Mongolian officer was who met us in the desert, and I wonder what would have happened if we had managed to bring that document back to headquarters. Why did Yamamoto not simply leave us on the right bank of the Khalkha and cross over by himself? He would have been able to move around far more freely that way. Perhaps he had been planning to use us as a decoy for the Mongolian troops so that he could escape alone. It certainly is conceivable. Perhaps Corporal Honda realized this from the start, and that was why he merely stood by when the Mongolians killed him. In any case, it was a very long time after that before Corporal Honda and I had an opportunity to meet again. We were separated from the moment we arrived in Hailar and were forbidden to speak or even to see each other. I had wanted to thank him one last time, but they made that impossible. He was wounded in the battle for Nomonhan and sent home, while I remained in Manchuria until the end of the war, after which I was sent to Siberia. I was only able to find him after several years later, after I was repatriated from my Siberian internment. We did manage to meet a few times after that, and we corresponded, but he seemed to avoid talking about what had happened to us at the Khalkha River, and I myself was not too eager to discuss it. For both of us, it has simply been too enormous an experience. We shared it by not talking about it. Does this make any sense? This has turned into a very long story, but what I wanted to convey to you was my feeling that real life may have ended for me deep in that well in the desert of Outer Mongolia. I feel as if in the intense light that shone for a mere 10 or 15 seconds a day in the bottom of the well, I burned up the very core of my life, until there was nothing left. This is how mysterious that light was to me. I can't explain it very well, but as honestly and simply as I can state it, no matter what I have encountered, no matter what I have experienced since then, I ceased to feel anything in the bottom of my heart. Even in the face of those monstrous Soviet tank units, even when I lost this left hand of mine, even in the hellish Soviet internment camps, a kind of numbness was all I felt. It may sound strange to say this, but none of that mattered. Something inside me was already dead. Perhaps, as I felt at the time, I should have died in that light, simply faded away. That was the time for me to die. But as Mr. Honda had predicted, I did not die there. Or perhaps I should say I could not die there. I came back to Japan, having lost my hand and 12 precious years. By the time I arrived in Hiroshima, my parents and my sister were long since dead. They had put my little sister to work in a factory, which was where she was when the bomb fell. My father was on his way to see her at the time, and he, too, lost his life. The shock sent my mother to her deathbed. She finally passed away in 1947. As I told you earlier, the girl to whom I had been secretly engaged was now married to another man, and she had given birth to 2 children. In the cemetery, I found my own grave. There was nothing left for me. I felt truly empty, and knew that I should have not come back from there. I hardly remember what my life has been like since then. I became a social studies teacher and taught geography and history in high school, but I was not, in the true sense of the word, alive. I simply performed the mundane tasks that were handed to me, one after another. I never had one real friend, no human ties with the students in my charge. I never loved anyone. I no longer knew what it meant to love another person. I would close my eyes and see Yamamoto being skinned alive. I dreamed about it over and over. Again and again, I watched them peel the skin off and turn it into a lump of flesh. I could hear his heart-rending screams. I also had dreams of myself slowly rotting away alive in the bottom of the well. Sometimes it seemed to me that that was what had really happened and that my life here was the dream. When Mr. Honda told me on the bank of the Khalkha River that I would not die on the continent, I was overjoyed. It was not a matter of believing or not believing. I wanted to cling to something then, anything at all. Mr. Honda probably knew that and told me what he did in order to comfort me. But of joy there was to be none for me. After returning to Japan, I lived like an empty shell. Living like an empty shell is not really living, no matter how many years it may go on. The heart and flesh of an empty shell give birth to nothing more than the life of an empty shell. This is what I hope I have made clear to you, Mr. Okada.
Does this mean, I ventured, that you never married after returning to Japan?
Of course not, answered Lieutenant Mamiya. I have no wife, no parents, no siblings. I am entirely alone.
After hesitating a moment, I asked,
Are you sorry that you ever heard Mr. Honda's prediction?
Now it was Lieutenant Mamiya's turn to hesitate. After a moment of silence, he looked me straight in the face.
Maybe I am, he said. Maybe he should never have spoken those words. Maybe I should have never heard them. As Mr. Honda said at the time, a person's destiny is something you look back at afterward, not something to be known in advance. I do believe this. However, now it makes no difference either way. All I am doing now is fulfilling my obligations to go on living.
The boss came, and Lieutenant Mamiya favored me with a deep bow. Then he apologized to me for having taken up my valuable time.
Well then, I shall be on my way, he said. Thank you for everything. I am glad in any case that I was able to hand you the package from Mr. Honda. This means that my job is done at last. I can go home with an easy mind.
Using both his right hand and the artificial one, he deftly produced the necessary coins and dropped them into the fare box. I stood there and watched as the boss disappeared around the next corner. After it was gone, I felt a strange emptiness inside, a hopeless kind of feeling, like that of a small child who has been left alone in an unfamiliar neighborhood. Then I went home, and sitting on the living room couch, I opened the package that Mr. Honda had left me as a keepsake. I worked up a sweat removing layer after layer of carefully sealed wrapping paper until a sturdy cardboard box emerged. It was a fancy Cutty Sark gift box, but it was too light to contain a bottle of whiskey. I opened it to find nothing inside. It was absolutely empty. All that Mr. Honda had left me was an empty box.